Okay, so we'll just wait to see. I'm just going to go on the...
Yeah.
Okay, nothing in the... All right. Just getting the link for the event. Okay. Let's see. Wait. Next. Okay. Good. So we got 5 people watching. So we are here for the postmortem of Being an Event, which we have sort of stumbled through collectively, in a reading group for our group Zero Books Capital Comrades, which I'm sure some of you are familiar with. Recently, it's been a great theater of inner Marxist factional conflict. So very interesting in that regard.
Really? Why?
Oh no! I mean, I don't want to get into it. But okay. When I make these discrete references, you can't ask me to elaborate things.
I don't actually look at the Facebook group, though. Like, I think you're, yeah.
I know you're on another you're on another dimension. You've just like transcended consciousness, but
I don't definitely transcended Facebook.
But we're here to talk a little bit. What we want to do is, because like in our reading group of Being an Event, which reading the book did really enhance my understanding of it. I don't have the same mathematical pedigree as Mari, who has some more formal education in this regard. But one thing we didn't have a lot of time to do maybe was discuss different potential criticisms or perspectives that have been taken to the work as a whole, because we were very, very invested while we were doing the group and getting through the sort of immediate section, which is often very draining, as I think Mari is aware. So what I want to do now is I want to talk a little bit about, I want to focus a little bit on different criticisms that have been made in the book. So I want to talk a little bit about, and again, it's going to be a bit approximate, but I want to talk a little bit about Francois Laruelle, his critique of Badiou in the text Anti-Badiou. That's actually the title. It's Anti-Badiou.
Nice.
I love like all these like retirement age French citizens like writing these poems. Anti-Badiou. I detest him. His metaphysics are totally wrong. And I also want to discuss a little bit the critique of Badiou that's been made by Adrian Johnston, particularly in his Prolegomena to Any Future Metaphysic trilogy of works. And I don't think the third one's out yet, but in his trilogy of works, in which he attempts to adapt Zizek'ian and to some extent Badiouian thought in order to revive the notion of a Hegelian or Marxist sort of dialectics of nature, and what his particular criticism of Badiou is. And I also wanted to talk about my criticism of Badiou. I love
That's a good one.
I also want to talk a little bit about the third canonical criticism. I want to talk about my criticism of Badiou, and I think today also that Mari wanted to. I thought maybe you wanted to discuss a little bit some of your feelings about the book, and also situate it in terms of your interest in Deleuze. Don't worry, she doesn't have cooties to our Marxist followers here.
Yeah, I was thinking of just kind of giving like an alternative view regarding maybe temporality, which I think isn't included really obviously as compared to Deleuze. And I think that's a general like mathematics problem. So that would go in with like a critique of using mathematics for defining ontology. And then the other thing, which would also be really neat, is kind of like the relationship between rules and particulars, or like axioms and particulars in this case, and what the
Mhm.
relationship is, because I think he also didn't really clearly define that, and that it's kind of tied into the temporality thing. And then I can also discuss my critique.
Okay, well, maybe what I'll do, maybe the best thing to do is maybe I should start and just discuss a little
I
bit.
think I'm good for like 5 to 10 minutes each, honestly.
Yeah,
Just
yeah.
go for it, and maybe we can jump in actually. Just yeah.
Oh,
Sounds
totally. Yeah, yeah. No, just a conversation, and maybe I'll just start and just say something about Laruelle, which is maybe a good starting point. So I'm not an expert in Francois Laruelle. I don't think anyone's an expert in Francois
never heard of
Laruelle.
the dude.
It's a little bit like you know, Islamic representations of God, right? You can't represent. One does not simply explain Francois Laruelle. But if I were to try to understand sort of Laruelle's project, what I would say is that he has this sort of, they call it non-philosophy, right? Which is sort of like, it's not non in the sense of anti, but it's non in the sense of you know, non-Euclidean geometry being non-Euclidean, right? So his point is not that we want to liquidate the contents of philosophy and the legacy that it's bequeathed us, but his point is rather that philosophy has a structural tendency to try to sort of circumscribe reality in relation to a set of like master concepts, right? And what this does is it actually,
Well, at least in the view.
yeah, well, yeah, we're gonna, you see where this is going, I think already. But what this does is it obstructs our ability to understand, you know, the sort of
The actual.
what he calls the real, right? Which is, I mean, I think in a sense you'd have to, it's a sort of void, right? That appears on account of the kind of limitations of the sort of structures we erect, right? You know, it kind of perforates holes, right? In the sort of
Well, so actually that's
yeah.
yeah. So I think that's kind of, if I just tie in there like my sort of like intuitive problem with his stuff. So I think, right, like he has this meta structure or structure or whatever you want to call it. And right, so then the particulars or the events, they drill holes in it. But for me, like as an engineer and a human being, I think particulars more like, right, particulars more shape the actual structure and constantly redefine it. But they tie into they are the construction. So I think for him it's this sort of like negativity. And it doesn't really like the structure and the particular, it doesn't really feed into each other in a way that is intuitive for me of real life. Just like when you write a program, right? Like you write something like, oh, it's gonna fit in, and then you run it, and then like shit breaks because the shit out there doesn't actually fit in. But what you do then is you take the shit that broke it and you weave it into the structure. So your structure now changes, and then it works until something else comes in which breaks it. But the breakage itself is constructive. So it doesn't actually pierce a hole. It like points to the fact that like the particular is now represented within a structure, and then it redefines the structure to subsume it. Does that make
Yeah, well, and I think for me one of the big tensions is the fact like, so any of these comments about, oh well, you know, things change and it's necessary to acknowledge that. I mean, Badiou does have an engine of change in his system, right? You know, in sort of the way that you know, in the way that there are things that are recognized as you know, included but not belonging in the kind of void, right? In the event, right? We have this kind of
but it seems to be this like very disruptive thing, right? Like right, like for him, I feel like the events of change are like the French Revolution, and then the change is at such an order, right? It doesn't account for like continual change.
Well, yeah,
micro-change.
I mean, his like he does acknowledge continual change, but yeah, there's a bit. The focus is on the sites of rupture, right? The dramatic sites of rupture. I mean, you could say that in a way, though, like his system is an attempt to think the relationship between, you know, consistency and dramatic change, right? So when he talks about like, you know, it's like he talks about language. It's like, well, obviously people are using language in different ways, right? But when he talks about this process where you have to nominate from within your existing lexicon to refer to these radical breaks that occur, right? He's talking about something more significant, which is transpiring, right? And I think there's a metaphor with poetry there, right? About the need to bend language. But I don't think he means to say by that no one. I agree with what you're saying, but on a subtler level, I don't think he's saying that people aren't using language in different ways, in normal basis. Even if it's the event that really, you know.
But like even that, it's kind of like it's like almost like a multitude of representation, right? Like, yeah.
Well, it's a representation that isn't pushed to a point of radical self-questioning, let's say. But wait,
But go to your thing.
Yeah, let me just get through this a little bit on Laruelle, because it's not too complicated. But well, not too complicated in the extremely exoteric rendering that I'm going to give it here. But so in Laruelle's book, well, okay, so for Laruelle, it's interesting, and you know, there is, if you look at the void, if you look at the real, obviously there's also some kind of similarity between Badiou and Laruelle, but there's also a difference. So you know, Laruelle has a book called Introduction to Non-Marxism, and what he tries to kind of telescope in that book is the way that Marx's particular genius is to sort of take this lateral step in which he looks outside of the philosophical tradition for resources to explain what philosophy is, right? So he broadens the canvas of what it could conceivably represent. And this, for actually, Laruelle has referred to himself as the son of Marx, le fils de Marx, right? Fils du Marx, yeah. And I think, which is just funny, but I think it's because of this gesture, right? But he uses all these different analogies, right, to how this functions, right? So he talks about the shift to, you know, away from traditional physics toward like more, you know, sort of quantum models, right? He talks about, you know, the shift beyond Euclidean geometry, the shift with Marxism, right? So he's very, very interested in this kind of process. And so he has this book called Anti-Badiou, and his critique of Badiou is basically that he says Badiou is like a very, very traditional philosopher in a way.
Okay. Yeah.
Right? Because he produces these conceptual structures, right? Which of course have to have a certain degree of suppleness to them. And then he's like, this is the way the world works. Right? And Laruelle's point in this book, which probably should just be an essay because it's very long. Laruelle's point is that, you know, when you say these things like, you know, well, real events issue from politics, you know, science, art or love. You know, it's like, what does that even mean? Like, you know, it's like, okay, right? But you know, it's there's no way. The problem is there, like, some of it will seem more or less reasonable, but there's no way of separating these sort of hard injunctions from a certain kind of arbitrariness or contingency, right? Which is always sort of the undoing philosophy, right? Does that make sense?
Yeah. Like he's trying to subsume these things under the philosophy rather than actually feeding from them. The problem that I have with him, though, is that I wouldn't even necessarily call him like a philosopher, because for me, philosophy is meant to be this like creative, right? Like creating concept thing for sure. But I feel like what he's doing is he's not really creating anything, right? He's just trying to do the mapping and the subsuming under the set theory. So I feel like he's almost trying to like, he's like the science, or like trying to scientize, I don't even know how to say it, philosophy.
I mean, I'd have
Like,
to hard disagree.
put poetry under grammar, you know, in that sort
Yeah,
of sense. So I feel like he's actually taking away the crux of philosophy in this work.
but that's I feel like that's already like a very like, you know, I mean,
yeah, like analytic thing to do.
yeah. Well, I mean, yeah, because if you look at analytical philosophy, it's like that's philosophy, but that, you know, that's quite schematic in this way. You know, if you look at rationalist philosophy, right? You know, there's a real.
But I feel like analytic philosophy is like almost, I don't know. Like I feel like in the beginning, analytic philosophy actually expanded the impact of logic and math and language and gave it like new life.
Yeah.
Whereas in what I would think of like post or like very, very late analytics is not really philosophical work, right? Like what have they done that is new? Like where have they gone where that is new? They haven't really bridged any gaps.
I mean,
They're just trying to like stay within the system of mapping.
I guess the new thing is like analytical Hegelianism inspired by the Pittsburgh school, right? So trying to, you know, progress beyond some of the dualist models and assumptions that traditionally informed it.
I don't know enough about analytic philosophy, but like you see what I mean. Like it's not such a black and white easy thing to do. But this is what this book has felt like, right? Like in no way, in no like part has he tried to go beyond the math or beyond his philosophy or beyond some other philosophy, right? Like he's almost trying to equalize the ontology and the set theory. The already existing things. So in that way, it's not really a creative project.
Well, I think again, there are you know, there are systematic and non-systematic philosophers, right? So there are philosophers who are sort of deterritorializing in terms of their function being to kind of expose us to, you know, the openness, right, to break with system, right, and to expose us, you know, and then there
I'm not saying it's not necessary. Like, I just, you know, whatever.
And it's interesting because when Marx was getting started, he went and he read a lot of he's very influenced by Epicurus, right? His thesis was on Epicurus, right? And it was a specific.
What did Epicurus do again?
It was early in the atomists, right? The people who posited the atoms, like the ancient Greek philosophers. And Marx, but there's a particular reason he went to Epicurus, because I think, you know, the question, and I think Epicurus was working. I mean, I could be wrong with my facts, but I think he was working after Aristotle, and Marx was, I think, trying to answer the question of how, you know, or allegorize the question of how does one do philosophy after the system of Hegel, right? So Hegel's sort of work is so comprehensive and systematic that we spend a lot of time. You see these people like Kierkegaard and Nietzsche and so on, right? A lot of what they're trying to do, and Deleuze is part of this in a way, right, is get out from under these systematic methods. Yeah. So Badiou, so I guess I would just hesitate to say, well, philosophy is, you know, it's not creative or it's not. I mean, I think there are two kinds of philosophy, and I think Badiou is closer to the systematic one.
Yeah.
You know, than the other one, which would demarcate a difference with.
I mean, I wouldn't like calling it like systematic, because I don't think that like creative philosophy is not necessarily systematic, but traditionalist. We can call it traditionalist under some school, reaffirming. Yeah.
Well, it reaffirms, because when you create a system that has these kind of that purport, even if, of course, Badiou's system is sensitive to the postmodern shift, it is sensitive to difference up to a point. But in any case, right, it encloses it within a larger structure. And when you create a kind of system that does that, in a way, it's reaffirming of the human capacity to totalize reality. Right. And this is what, you know, in a way, you can argue that this is what, in a sense, you know, modernity tilts against. Right. You know, Freud says, like, you know, what is it? The three humiliations. Right. There was, there was Copernicus, and there was Darwin, and now there's me, right? So, like the experience of modernity has been an experience of a certain kind of a contradiction between like the accumulation of like economic and scientific power and in certain parts of the world in any case, and the realization of our acute smallness in the sort of grand scheme of things which we come to perceive, right? So you can see how then there's different tendencies which emerge in that, right?
Yeah, I was thinking like slightly or maybe more than slightly related to this discussion, like the whole ban situation now that's happening on Twitter and Facebook and Amazon Web Services and stuff. If you take that sort of idea to an end, it doesn't allow for a grouping of people with anti-mainstream representative seemingly elected power groups through violent acts, which is actually I don't want to cast any moral judgment on whether that's good or bad, but it seems that like if this is to continue in this way, it sort of like really breaks the possibility of a revolution on a larger scale, which we thought, or at least I thought, would be quite easily done online, right, through some underground paths, but not really. So in that sense, I was thinking like, to drive change, it would actually have to be very incremental and within the framework, and not like drilling holes, which Badiou would like. So I don't know. I just thought about that. I don't know if you have anything. Is there any thoughts going through your head with that?
Well, I mean, I think that, I guess about this kind of theme of, one thing that's important in Badiou's work, and I've talked a little bit about, cancel culture lately, and I've said, well, I don't really think it's so much cancel culture as it's like partition culture, right? In the sense that it speaks to a moment in which the culture is divided enough that we're not able to have a dialogue collectively, right? And because I think there's a paradox when people say cancel culture, because like the right, they're like, we're all getting canceled. It's like, well, the far right's stronger than they've ever been. So I think there's something a little bit over hasty to say, well,
no, the polarization is like a special topic, which is crazy, because for me, like the more I think about it, the less I'm clear on like what the specific part that was wrong was, right? Like they chose to believe someone or something, don't we too? Given that they believed that something unconstitutional was happening, they went to defend their constitution, wouldn't we too? And so on and so on. But yeah, the polarization is a really interesting thing. Well, I don't quite understand it.
What I see is that like, I think, so the one tendency I think, which is very characteristic of sort of liberal societies, say, well, we should all be kind of one sort of monistic vision. I think Badiou here would say, like when he quotes Mao, like the one becomes two, right? And scission is a very, very important theme throughout being an event. I don't think it's sometimes it's just necessary to have those kind of cuts, right? Because to not have them would be to pay a greater cost, right, than to have them. I think the issue that we see now is that the one becoming two, it's becoming a two of sort of status quo neoliberalism versus the far right. And I think that the left has a very difficult time situating itself within that, because it doesn't want to just hold pom-poms for the neoliberal side, but obviously it has a stronger bias against the far right. So it creates a lot of ambiguities. But I'm hesitant to say that the division is bad in of itself. I mean, obviously, in a sense,
I don't think the existence of difference to such an extreme is bad in and of itself. But I think the gaping chasm of like non-communication is
Mhm.
bad.
Mhm. Yeah, well, I guess what I
But
mean though
again,
is
like if there
sometimes
was, would we
communication,
go back to one? Like,
sometimes communication isn't, there are limitations to what it can resolve, and I think this is the lesson of Marx, right? These issues will be resolved when the economic, contradictions which shape them are resolved, and the path will show itself when you are meant to cross it. And
yeah,
I think I
you're
mean,
very
you have to
Tao
be
sometimes.
sorry. I'm very
I don't
what?
know. You're very Tao sometimes. I
Well, you
remember
have
when
to be
I,
active in that. But I'm saying it's not like
yeah,
you can't just
yeah,
flip a switch.
absolutely,
It's
absolutely.
there's no way to.
But
Um,
I remember I once asked you like why people don't see the truth when you say it to them, and you said because it's not a thing, it's a way. Maybe you didn't use those words per se, but that's what you said, and I was
that
like,
sounds
fuck,
so
that's
ridiculous.
good.
It sounds so
No, but
ridiculous.
it's good. It's actually it's like a path, right? Um,
But I think but we should get back. We should get back a little more. Uh, we should get back a little bit to the text
yeah,
a
yeah,
little
yeah.
more. Did you want to talk a little bit about your thing about time? Did you want to kind of get on that?
Yeah, so and this can be Deleuzian for sure, but it's actually Bergson's, right?
Hmm.
Deleuze just kind of revived the idea, and the idea is that mathematics specifically doesn't really have a concept of time. Um, so it only spatializes things. So for instance, if you think how you would represent time in math, it's usually just another dimension which is drawn, right? Like if you want to represent um, 2 points in time, um, the, um, the problem is, and so this is a question like what is the mathematical time, right? The spatial time, it's almost like snapshots. So if you think about it, you can think about minutes, and then you can think about seconds or milliseconds or nanoseconds and so on. But what you always get is 2 points in time, like from one nanosecond to the other second. And Bergson's question is, what happens in between? Where's
Hmm.
the in between? Like,
Hmm.
where's the flow, right? Like, what connects it?
Hmm.
Because we can keep dividing in like these smaller units of measure, but there's still these spatialized snapshots of space. For him, time is this sort of like connective, flowy shit. Um,
Brilliant.
it's really beautiful, and he makes a really great point of like we really need it because there are two things. First of all, either this connective thing exists, and we're not representing it in math, which is why he actually like decided to not do his math PhD, or it doesn't exist. But if it doesn't exist, what you get to is you get a rupture of being. So you have a being at a point in time, or like a point in space time,
Mm.
and then you get another point in space time, being in point in space time. But the in between, if it doesn't exist, you need to recreate it. So that's really crazy to have these ruptures in existence. It doesn't seem like that could ever be the truth, that the universe keeps recreating itself in these micro moments that are uncatchable. Um, so that's the thing, really. That's the crux of it. Mathematics just doesn't have the concept of time. And I think that makes it like deeply unsuitable to be the metaphysical, you know, representation or the basis of ontology for the world, and the experience. Another thing is that and I mean, I think that's you can ask any person who does any sort of thing in like applied sciences, whether it's like physics, applied maths, engineering, whatever. The concepts are great, and they're a really good framework that's gonna get revisioned all the time, but they don't match the reality. They never do. Things are really messy in the world. Math is just really a very partial picture of the world in every sense. So that was kind of my, yeah, I just wanted to point that out.
One
And it wasn't
clearly,
something that was obvious to me before Bergson.
yeah.
Like I was also like, shit, that's a really good point.
So you're saying, so sorry, I'm embarrassingly undereducated in Bergson. You're saying that the universe creates itself between points in time? That's what you're
I'm
saying?
saying it would have to, according to math, because math doesn't have a concept of the continuity.
Oh, okay, so math will always, there's always like a terminus.
Exactly. So
Yeah.
so mathematical conception of time is actually a snapshot. And Deleuze, I mean, I haven't read it. I think I just like watched a tiny bit of an interview somewhere, but Deleuze's sort of analogy was like a movie. You know, when you see a movie, it's actually like you get 8 pictures or however in some fraction of time, which is imperceptible to a human eye. So you actually get these snapshots. So you have the illusion of movement and continuity, even though they're actually pictures. Like a movie is a set of pictures, but it's impossible for the world to work that way. To have the space in between, or the recreation, or like the point of non-being, the point of non-existence, right? Like we're not glitches on a lower level, or at least I don't believe that we are. We could adopt that view. That would be where we get to with in Badiou's world.
Yeah, you said you said glitches, is what you said.
Yeah.
Okay, so this is really interesting. So I just want to segue this to a discussion about just a couple of receptions of Badiou. So, on one hand, I guess the philosopher in the past 15 years or so, who has shot to fame the most quickly, and a lot of people have compared his rapid ascent to that of Derrida in the 60s, you know, when the name of Derrida was appearing
You're
suddenly.
gonna say Zizek? If you say Zizek, I'm just gonna leave.
No, Quentin Meillassoux, right? And I say, because I say shot to fame suddenly, because Zizek built up like over a long time,
Okay,
right?
yeah.
But Meillassoux published a book in 2007 called Après la finitude, and it was translated into After Finitude. And Meillassoux was a student of Badiou, and I think he originally read Being an Event around 1992 or something, so quite early on. And so you see that like for Badiou, philosophy doesn't have the ability to penetrate inconsistent multiplicity in any direct way. It can just sort of cite from it, right?
Yeah. And
And
that's a good point, right? Like the continuity of the inconsistent multiplicities for Deleuze versus the void for Badiou, because the math cannot represent them. It cannot represent continuity. It just takes snapshots and glitches.
yeah, well, and I think it's interesting because for Meillassoux, he tries to go beyond this, and he looks at the way he's inspired by the way Badiou uses math and set theory, but he tries to say, well, you know, I'm going to vulgarize a little bit, but he wants to go further than Badiou does in overcoming dualism, because I think his concern would be that in Badiou you're still, part of his concern would be that in Badiou you're still stuck in this kind of, you know, okay, you have, you know, events kind of issuing from inconsistent multiplicity, but you're not representing inconsistent multiplicity. So it may not be like a subject and an object in the most orthodox sense, but it still imposes a chasm. And so what Meillassoux basically says is that he says what we need to do is to get rid of, because he goes into the way, he looks at the way that like philosophers like Hume or Kant, they justified the notion that reality enjoys a certain stability when we observe it, based on the idea that there must be, well, I'm thinking of Kant here, based upon the idea that there must be some kind of stability associated with our representational facility. right? So in other words, like if we play pool, wouldn't the balls just like fly all over, right? If there wasn't some, and you could maybe say um how do I say, it's that there's it doesn't, not to say that it's just that it's conditioned on one side necessarily, but there has to be some
I
kind of
see what
harmony.
you're talking about. I
There
see
has
what
to be
you're
some kind of
talking about.
harmony.
Like representation in terms of perception.
Yeah, there has to be some kind of harmonization.
Yeah,
Right?
Bergson has a book on this. I have like I have some intuitive ideas about this, but yeah, keep going.
Well, so Measu's argument is basically, well, he says, but what if? So he says, like, but what if that's not the case, right? So what if we get rid of the principle of sufficient reason, keep the principle of non-contradiction, and what if we just do away with this? What if we say like that, you know? And again, looking at these mathematical notions of aleatory function, saying like, what if the world is just fucking hyper chaos? That's what we call it, hyper chaos, right? And in that context, when you dispense with the idea, right, that these things require a reason, right, then you no longer need a representational facility to which a certain stability is allotted in harmony with the world to represent it, because it's like we're experiencing things directly as they happen, but they're not conditioned in that way. Right? Does that sort of make sense?
You mean like the ordering or the systematization or whatever is only like within perception, like within your own perception, not
No,
in the
no,
outside?
it's the idea that there can be a bona fide connection. I love these people, and I really got to do something about the I love the people we get from Twitch. It's incredible. Okay, I think I'm gonna pull our Twitch plug. 1 second, just because. Okay, yeah, there we go. Okay, so what I meant to say was that if we have, the idea is that there doesn't have to be a division between, or like you don't have to understand reality as occurring at the interstices of mind and world. If you think, well, look, like anything that happened in the world, right? We don't have to explain, right, the supposed continuity of events by appealing to the fixity of our categories of the pure understanding or whatever. And that itself is based on the idea that like that itself is
Doesn't that
essentially
mean that just like
centric.
there's only stability within the mind, within the perception of the representation?
No, what he's saying, because the idea, he appeals to the way that set theory is used by Badiou to explain both like that internal to itself, it can explain both stability and instability, right?
Okay.
So once he's made that, he said, well, reality, like the stability of reality, right, doesn't have to be conditioned by the principle of the sufficient reason. It can just be like, like this sort of arbitrary occurrences that nevertheless stabilize based on this sort of mathematical matrix, right? And then he says, well, then we don't have to explain that, oh, like the world is mind and world are occurring at these interstices, because it's a direct.
What you mean is that like there is consistency within the laws in like a certain, like in a certain point in the set at a certain point in the time for certain cases that we can observe. Yeah.
But the laws are not internal.
Yeah,
right?
yeah.
I just think it's very interesting, because you were talking about us being glitches, and this goes totally in that direction of everything.
Yeah. That is, yeah. It's interesting. I think, yeah. I think it becomes like for me, and I just like I completely don't understand like how I think about these things. But for me, it's really like it gets really complex when the world is just made up of minds, whether that be human or animal or something like that. These sort of like intelligent living structures. And so that there's no world, right? There's just a set of minds communicating sort of information to each other. So I think that's where like I would more like to go with my view of these things. But we can go that way. There's no need to like, you know, just like we can say, oh, I don't know, nothing really outside of my mind exists. We can say everything is actually chaos, on if you scale out enough, and orderly if you scale in enough. It's very like context based, which
Yeah.
I think is very valid way to look at things, and partially absolutely true. I think, yeah, it doesn't intuitively go for me.
Yeah. Well, the obvious
But yeah, maybe.
problem here is that it just becomes religion, right? At some point, that would be the issue, because like, you know, so he has a thesis he's never finished called The Divine in Existence, and in that he's like, oh well, he's like, to truly, you know, be secular in the sense that he means, and I'm paraphrasing, would be to hope for a God to come who could redeem all the dead, you know, because it's like at this point, it's like, now that you've just declared that anything could happen, it's like, well, where do you really go? So I actually literally don't mean any like Masonians. Someone pointed this out to me, and I think it's interesting that people were inspired by Graham Harman, Ray Brazier, other people who Badia has maybe directly or indirectly influenced. But there's like, it just doesn't have that much interest on a, like, once you make that kind of statement, it's like,
exactly, okay, it becomes very radical. So, and I mean, it also, it doesn't really have any consequences for us, does it? Just like the glitches in time thing, right? Like, well, maybe time doesn't exist and everything is actually space. Okay, whatever. The universe gets recreated on some level or something, whatever. But the more interesting question is like, well, if time does exist, what is it? And where is it? Which is a really interesting question to ask, right? Because like, oh, we just said it wasn't spatialized, but what I mean is like, is it outside of me or is it inside of me? And you know, then we get to these questions of soul, or like of monads or whatever you want to call them, or atoms and so on, of ether, of all of these sort of like vague things. But the story becomes a bit richer, and what we can do becomes a bit richer.
Well, and so yeah, this is always the risk with, and I want to say this is always the risk with mathematical structures, is that it can be like a very, very eloquent way of representing things, and I think the history of philosophy attests to that. But I also think sometimes it struggles to connect that up with, you know, the kind of imperatives we would adopt on a sort of phenomenal level.
Absolutely.
And it's like, you know, and then I think, you know, and Badia does try to connect it, but it's a bit like, you know, insofar as those connections are made, it's like, it's not owing to any internal part of the system. It's just like Badia being like, well, you know, okay, you know, Marxism is an event and the French Revolution is an event and this is an event. It's like, well, presumably, you know, if you're a pro, you know, if you're, okay, I get it. Like, he adds these little things, like he tries to do these little, you know, he you know, in terms of universality, he does relate to math in some ways, but like, I still can't fully escape the feeling that like, if you're like a pro-Trumper, it's like the Capitol Hill uprising could be an event.
Exactly. And exactly. And it's really hard to say where you draw the line, because it's also really hard to say where you draw the line of a set, or the encyclopedia of knowledge, or all of these like concepts that he talks about, right? Like the way he talks about it seems like this sort of like universal thing. But if you start taking it to micro levels, it could become more rich, right? If it kind of like recurs into itself deeper down. So you have your own world and the events of your world and so on, which rupture holes in your knowledge.
Yeah.
But he would never go there. That's not what he wants. He's not really interested, right? Like, he's not really interested in representing an element as a set of itself. And yeah.
Well, and politically, this has, like, I think it has to sort of be understood politically as well. And also to the degree that, like, by making the event sort of like periodic, right?
Mm-hmm.
You know, and by creating a sort of plane of stabilization beyond that,
Mm-hmm.
it also becomes a way of justifying, I think, you know, a certain kind of state socialism, right? You know, because it's, you know, it's not this sort of libertarian, okay, like, you know, we have to always change constantly, and any kind of molar structure is averse to that, right? It's like, you know, it's like, well, these things are trying to, you know, they're trying to have fidelity to these events, right? And that there's a defensibility to that, right?
Yeah.
You know, until such time as that sort of reached its. So I think
Yeah.
I think the best thing, and I will say, I think the best thing about Badiou's system is the eloquence of the relationship between stability and change, which is not to say it doesn't have problems. But I think this, you know, I think he only becomes a great philosopher when he takes the problem of difference, when he takes the problem of change seriously.
Yeah, and in that sense, he's very Deleuzian, right? Like the one question that he asks himself is this quite literally difference and repetition, and where does it lie? And they both tackle these two forces as sort of like basic ontological forces, and I think that's very well. That's a very good position. That is the main question.
Mm-hmm. Well, in Anti-Adopt, for example, like Deleuze says, you know, we have to intensify that part of the book, which is what is it, Primitive Savage? I forget the exact title. It's like, but that particular part of the book, which I think is probably, like, in broad cultural terms, like the most influential thing he ever wrote. But that when he makes a reference to the late great Samir Amin, and says, well, you know, if he uses arguments, like he says, like, if capitalism is able to offset the falling rate of profit, his argument, right, which is really from Balabar, but anyway, based on, you know, in its sort of welfare state form, or with the use of finance capital or whatever, then maybe we just have to intensify the process. The point here is that it's a vector of intensification that at least at the point of Anti-Oedipe, and I think beyond, though he does temper it a bit in Mille Plateau, that drives Deleuze's political views. Right. Now in Mille Plateau, you get a more metabolic relationship between deterritorialization and territorialization. But I still think Deleuze is fundamentally associated with this, right? Like, maybe wrongly, but I think this is what he's associated with, and I think that's sort of what.
Whereas in Badiou would want like a complete rupture.
Well, but Badiou would see it more as a rupture, and then an attempt to honor that rupture and carry it forth, right, and stabilize it, right, pending the next rupture, which I suppose would be, I don't know, I hesitate to say that's its apotheosis, but you get the idea. Yeah.
Yeah, I'm not really seeing the rupture coming though, dude. You know.
But do ruptures ever come in that way? Is that how history works? I mean, it's like what Gramsci said about, you know, he said about New Year's, he said, I hate New Year's because, you know, we set these dumb dates like 1492, 1789. You know, they govern our lives. He's like, it elides the fact that history is any change that it transpires within history. You know, and it's funny when you talk to like old people, because like if you talk to them about, you're like, you know, like you talk to them about these things like that we remember in history books, right? We'll be like, you know, where were you in the Beatles or on Ed Sullivan or something? And people, I never really paid attention to that. You know, it's like people don't live that way.
Yeah.
You know.
Yeah.
So that's an interesting question as well. And there's a sense in which I think it's history that we organize, and I'm making the same point I think you are as well about math and time. History we organize into these points. But that's
not how we live them.
Yeah, but that's never the same as our life,
Yeah. Or like history as it unfolds. Yeah.
Yeah.
I think that's a good point. I mean, right, like when I look back at the last year, I was just talking to someone about this and I was like, actually, I think it was quite good for me. It's been formative, made me rethink a lot of things, notice a lot of things. And then that person was like, yeah, well, actually, like we don't really have a good memory for pain, which is why, like, for instance, if you hit your toe, right, like you can't really recall the pain. Whereas then it's very easy for us to like relive the good stuff, or to actually relive. So the prints of the bad don't really, they don't really stay. And so I was like, yeah, actually, it's been a fucking horrendous year. Um, and it's really interesting because, like, it hasn't been a year, right? It's just that, like, now there's some internal stuff that is different than it has had been, like, a snapshot year before. Um, but it's really hard to think of it as like a period. It's more like, okay, well, I can maybe venture to think of myself a year ago from now. Um, but even that is like almost unimaginable, right? At best, what you have is now.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, time is strange, and there aren't enough philosophies of time today. That's true.
Yeah,
Um,
dude, read
and
Bergson. He's mind opening, and he's not that hard to read. Actually, we should read Bergson together. I'll be down. He
that'd
has
be
some.
good. Yeah.
He has something called the two sources of morality and religion, and he talks about like duty and shit.
Yeah, I mean,
That could be a
it's
good
just
like COVID podcast.
yeah, I mean, it's not necessarily the thing they give you in like super hardcore philosophy classes, but he is well respected, considered very good by any. Um, I would be interested in doing that. And I do wonder, right, about like philosophies of time. I also wonder if it's not the case that, you know, the sort of quantitative organization of time in relation to value reproduction, which is characteristic of capitalism, as well as the sort of hegemony of capitalism. And, Francis
If those are
Fukuyama,
tied,
this is the end of history. If this hasn't, because like, Catherine Malibu asked this question. See, like, where are our philosophies of time?
yeah, and it's really qualitative for him, right? And that's something we don't really think about. Again,
Mhm.
qualitative change is only available within time, not within space. Intuitively, it's very obvious what it is, right?
Mhm.
It's anything you've ever felt. But it's very hard to put it in language. Again, language is spatializing, math is spatializing.
But I want to before we finish, I just want to just kind of get to the last part of my exposition. So I guess Adrian Johnson has written a book, great trilogy of books. 2 volumes are out so far, called Prolegomena and a Future Metaphysic, and it's an attempt to so basically like uh, you know there are different readings of Lacan, but sort of in the ontological reading of Lacan, you would say like reality, there's like, a constitutive lack in reality. So there's always something missing in reality.
Mhm.
Um, and, you know, sexuality, desire, we should say, and it's related to sexuality, is sort of how we kind of phenomenally and primordially experience this. But this attests to a lack which is always in the world. So there's an ontological statement being made there, right? So in other words, like you won't find pure consistency in nature, right? There's always something that is outside of it, right?
Yeah.
There's always an exceptionality or a difference. So um, Lacan, in some of his work and some of his later disciples have taken this up. They've tried to translate this into a theory of science. So what Johnson does, he kind of carries this forth, and his first book in the series is a critique of what he feels are the limitations, because he says like, so far as there's been like a materialism in modern French philosophy, it's been based on mathematical formalization, right? It's not really like the matter of science, the matter of stuff, right? So what he argues for is he tries to, and actually Lacan, especially early on, right, was fond of using these kind of mathematical, kind of mathemes, right? And Badiou talks about the matheme, right? So there's a lineage there, right? Like you can trace between like Lacan and Badiou and so on. And what Johnston wants to do is he wants to put this on the scientific terrain, right? So he looks at like Stephen Jay Gould, like how he shows how it's a reading of natural selection that stresses contingency, right? For example, so he looks at that and puts it there. So I think that's very interesting, and he relates it to Hegel's dialectics of nature, right? As well as the Marxist dialectics of nature. And he rejects sort of what he sees as the kind of organic monism that maybe Engels is supportive of in some ways. But for me, even this isn't quite enough, because I think, it's one thing to say, well, mathematical formalization isn't enough, but I think what we really need is or to say science is how we should do it. I think none of these things get to really the root of Marx's discourse, right? Which I think, if we really want to understand it quite radically, I think it's the idea that the notion of like an external ontological layer, right? Which both Badiou and Johnston appeal to in different ways, right? Is already conditioned by the exchange of commodities, right? So like philosophy begins in ancient Greece, right? When when you have currency in Miletus, right? You have Thales, for example, saying all is water. Like this search for like a constituent element that shapes that governs reality, right? I think you can make a strong argument because it's based on the separation of value from non-value, right? So if you sleep with someone, that doesn't create value, but if you sleep with someone in charge, that creates value, right? So there's already a dualism, right, that enters into the world at that point. So I guess what I mean is that, and this is a materialism of economic form.
Does this have, I mean, the second example you gave, I guess there's like the body or the satisfaction is the actual like commodity being exchanged, but there's just like a power disbalance and a potential transferal of it, right? I wouldn't say, well, I mean, yeah, is that what's needed for philosophy? But
well, I'm not saying that but it's very interesting, right? Because you talked about, and I'm not saying there aren't counter tendencies in philosophy, but it's very interesting when you talked about like the discrete points of mathematics.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
Because if you think of mathematics, which obviously is related to commodity exchange historically or any, but if you think of that, and then you think of the discrete points occupied by commodities, right, in the process of their exchange, right, you can see how there's this like abstraction of reality.
No, I absolutely see what you mean. What I'm trying to understand is when have we ever been pre-exchange?
Well, I think so I'm drawing a lot here from Alfred Sohn-Rethel's book, Intellectual and Manual Labor, which is a huge book for me in my thesis. But I think his argument is that so you can trace exchange back a long time, but his argument is that exchange doesn't become reified to that degree until you have money, right? So this is why he says Greek philosophy begins with money. Okay. Right. Now you could say dualism or something is older than philosophy, and then you could say, well, maybe that goes back 10,000 years because
what about Chinese philosophy, and so on? Is that I know nothing about anything, but does that?
Let me read you a quote here that I wrote. Wait. What do you say? Let me see. I have
I mean,
something.
I only know one
Oh, here it is.
line
Yeah.
from Tao. It's like the ball is useful where it's not. So they definitely had balls. So they probably had money.
I guess in China, the 100 schools of thought, encompassing Taoism and Confucianism, as well as the logician school of Gongsun Longzi, also emerged with the introduction of money to China during the spring and autumn period, 771 to 476 BC. And in India, the minting of the region's first coins in the 6th century BC by the Mahajanapadas coincided with a period of tremendous philosophical flourishing, the most radical expression of which was arguably Charvaka atheism, a school that rejected samsara and argued that the Vedas owe their origins to humans rather than any divine authority, right?
So the Vedas existed pre.
I have to look. Wait. Yeah, I mean, the Vedas existed pre, but I guess what I'm saying here is like, it's not so much about dualism as it's about the way that you get this thinking where you're like, there is an autonomous world that has like a single constitutive element.
Yeah.
Right.
That's really interesting. Yeah. This is really interesting.
Cool. But you can see how profitably, and I'm going to tie this back because I always get into like this, when I take this approach, it also gets you interested in a lot of these like vitalistic things. Because obviously I think, monism and vitalism, I mean, to the extent that I see this dualistic tendency,
it's like that, just like a quick sentence of interruption. It's that sort of thing of like, you don't think until you have a fucking problem, right? Like, so yeah, maybe you don't philosophize until you have a rupture of actual value with value.
Well, I would sort of interpret like all monism, like, or quasi-monism, whether we're talking about Spinoza, whether we're talking about Deleuze, whether we're talking about Graham Harman, who releases books as, with the same steady reliability as
the
new Star Wars films come out, or Windows versions. I think I think you have to see these things as kind of like, for me anyway, I see them as like opposing themselves to the dualism, which is dominant because of value. I don't think they always know that they're doing that, right? I think there's varying degrees of awareness.
I mean, absolutely, it's to oppose the dualism. It's to like allow for the dualism and not have like a rupture. But I guess what you're saying is that the dualism itself begins with the introduction of money, or like the rupture of actual value and represented value.
Yeah, I mean, I wouldn't use exactly those terms, but yeah, I understand.
Yeah.
With the abstraction, yeah, with the physical manifest expression. Homogeneous physical expression of value, because value obviously precedes that, but it's like barter.
I would always think, I mean, just like now thinking out loud, I would think that if there's anything before that, it would be the actual like body mind kind of issue, which stems from language. Where like in language, right? Language is the spatial field of differences. If we talk about the body, come on, it's actually like things are pretty in sync, like I have to think about whether I feel this and that. Actually, I don't feel this and that. I just feel this.
Yeah.
So that would also be like the first split for me.
In the thesis, I explain like that break based on in relationship
to commodities.
No, even I go earlier in relationship to language, but because I guess like a lot of people have argued that the syntax in language is based on like tool making. Like it's only when you have sophisticated tool making that you have like syntactic structures develop. So I argue that there is a sort of like potentially a kind of proto-dualism, but it's not the same as the later structure. But obviously, all this is like quite insane. But I just want to say, though about Badia is I guess my problem would be that if you look at it from that angle, right, you would say that his appeal, his ontological appeal to mathematics is already relying on concepts which emanate from commodity exchange.
Yeah.
Right.
So he's not really Marxist.
Well, I didn't say that, by the way. I mean,
which is the greatest insult you can give to someone.
I didn't say that. And by the way, according to this theory, I just
like I said that he wasn't really a philosopher.
I mean, the obvious problem with this whole stupid theory is that like it's based on a notion of materiality that can only be justified based on the same structural matrix that it criticizes.
Yeah.
I mean, so but in all philosophy, I think just all philosophy just reaches a point where it collapses, right? But I just want to say this is
there's nothing wrong with circularity. Like, it's how we operate.
Well, philosophy is just, it's just staying as long above water as you can while knowing you're eventually going to sink, right? Because nobody stays up forever, right? Nobody can swim forever. So that's my problem. That's my problem with Badia. But I do think that Badia did something like historically, because I want to take kind of a dialectical view, and I do think Badia did something that's quite historically important. Yeah, because I think that you got to remember, like when Badia wrote Être événement in 1988, right? That the Marxism was in a really
1986?
88. Yeah.
88.
Ketchup and wheat, not ketchup and six, yeah. But ketchup and wheat. Yeah, so Marxism was in a really bad state, right? Like the Berlin Wall falls 1 year later. You had the sort of aborted Soviet war in Afghanistan. Deng Xiaoping was privatizing a lot of things in China, so on and so on. And I think what he kind of does is, I think part of his gesture is to kind of freeze Marxism, like Austin Powers being frozen, so we can fight Dr. Evil in the future. I think what he does is he kind of freezes Marxism by giving it this ontological, justificatif, right? Like, and then I think, in a way, I think our job today is to kind of unfreeze it and bring it back to the level of productive forces, bring it to the level of economic forms, bring it, because all this is very abstract, right? So that would be my 2 cents. I don't know if
it's our job.
Our job at Zero Books Capital Comrades.
While you do the job.
But I'd love to read Bergson with you sometime as well. That'd be great.
Yeah. We can talk about that.
And we'd have to do a Marxist reading of Bergson.
Yeah, maybe after well, here's the thing. I just haven't read Creative Evolution and The Two Sources of Morality and Religion. And perhaps either would be relatively interesting and tangential to these discussions, neither quite perfect, right, in some way, but
yeah, we'd have to come up with a good title, like Can Marxism and Vitalism, coexist or something like that. I don't know.
Exactly.
But I think,
or like depolarizing the Facebook group.
Yeah. Well, I think what's good though, just this discussion, because I think we found a good line of flight, which is maybe exploring together how vitalism can relate to materialist theory, and in terms of thinking of mathematics and science and its relationship to commodity exchange. So that's all I had to say. Do you have any closing comments you want to make?
No, this is good. No? This was good. Yeah.
Okay. Well, thank you guys for tuning in. The few who are there, I'm sure more will catch this video later. I just want to say finally that on January 19th at 2 p.m. EST, Ben Burgess and I will be discussing what else? The China of Xi Jinping. And the event will be titled, Can the American Left Learn from China? I think that'll be very interesting because, Ben, of course, is I think opposed to the Chinese state in many respects, but also interested, I think, to discuss some of the economic management approaches they've taken, public ownership and so forth, and how this can be useful to study.
It's a very, very good question, but another good question is, do they want to?
It's true. It's true. And I also want to say, actually, it should be today. I don't know if we're gonna have some tech problems and it might go up tomorrow, but it should be today or tomorrow. I have a video going up that I shot with Ludovica Mancini, and it's called "Can't is it what can Italy teach the left?" And it's shot all over Italy. There's shots in Florence and Rome, and we discuss Italian republicanism and socialism. So we discuss Machiavelli, and then Caesar Borgia, and then Gramsci, and then the Autonomia and the Italian Communist Party, and then we kind of draw conclusions from that. And it ends at Trevi Fountain. So I encourage you guys to check that out. And I want to say also that on January 24th, we will be beginning our reading group on Chinese Marxism. So that is, I'll be starting with Ernesto Vargas. Mari's going to drop in sometime. Also, Elliot Rosenstock will potentially join eventually. But that is going to be a reading group devoted to reading Mao, Deng, and Xi. And I'm sure we're going to get different, interesting opinions there. So this has been the Being an Event, Zero Books Comrades, Zero Books Capital Comrades, pardon me, Being an Event for Zero Books Capital Comrades reading group. And I think the first, as I said, the first reading group ever to cover the whole book and be on YouTube for English YouTube anyway. So thank you guys very much if you've tuned in consistently. Thank you to Mari for bearing with us here. And thank you to myself, obviously, for being
thank you for having us.
for being so steady and unwavering in my dedication to this educational program. All right, guys. We hope you
God knows I've like suggested to give up many times.
Well, we made it. We made it. Good thing.
Yeah.
So thank you so much, guys, and we wish you a wonderful rest of your Tuesday. Okay. Supposing it is Tuesday. Have a good one.
Yeah.